Think airplanes have always looked like a metal tube with two wings attached? Think again. What if I told you the military once secretly poured millions into building an actual flying saucer? Or that brave pilots during World War II strapped themselves into a rocket-powered death trap capable of dissolving them alive before they even saw the enemy? Welcome to the bizarre side of aviation history. Some of these mechanical monstrosities completely defied the laws of physics, while others look like they belong in a science fiction movie. Today we are exploring the 10 weirdest, craziest, and truly unbelievable vintage airplanes that actually took to the skies. Hit that subscribe button right now and let us dive straight into the absolute madness. Starting off at number 1, we have an aircraft that looks less like a plane and more like a massive piece of flying plumbing. Meet the Stipa Caproni, often referred to as the flying barrel. Built in Italy in 1932 by aeronautical engineer Luigi Stipa, this bizarre machine was designed around a very specific aerodynamic theory. Stipa believed that by enclosing the propeller and the engine inside a hollow tube-shaped fuselage, he could compress the airflow and dramatically increase the engine efficiency using Bernoulli principles. This is essentially the grandfather of modern turbofan engines. But looking at it, the design is completely absurd. The fuselage was basically a giant wooden barrel with small wings bolted onto the sides. The pilot, Domenico Antonini, had an incredibly strange and noisy job. He essentially had to sit perched on top of this giant wooden tube, straddling the hollow center where massive amounts of air were being violently sucked through by the spinning propeller. Imagine the deafening roar of a heavy engine echoing inside a giant wooden drum right beneath your seat while you try to navigate through the open skies above. Surprisingly, the Stipa Caproni actually flew quite well. In fact, it was incredibly stable, but its top speed was a measly 81 miles per hour. The immense aerodynamic drag created by that massive barrel shape canceled out any efficiency gained by the internal propeller. The Italian military decided it was way too slow and canceled the project. On our weirdness meter, this flying barrel gets a solid 7 out of 10. But hey, if you think a flying barrel is strange, wait until you see the top-secret military project stolen straight from Area 51. At number 2, we step into the paranoid era of the Cold War with the Avro Canada VZ9 Avrocar. This was not just an airplane that looked weird, it was a functional flying saucer funded by the United States Army and Air Force. In the 1950s, the military was desperate for a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that could hover below enemy radar and then blast off at supersonic speeds to intercept Soviet bombers. Designer John Frost utilized the Coanda effect blowing engine exhaust over a curved saucer-shaped surface for massive lift. The human stakes here were absolutely immense. Test pilots weighing around 180 pounds were essentially strapping themselves onto a giant, unproven jet-powered frisbee weighing thousands of pounds. If the central fan failed, there were no wings to glide on. The machine would just drop like a stone. The military hoped this incredible machine would hit speeds of Mach 3 and soar into the stratosphere. The disappointing reality was that it became an absolute disaster. The heavy Avrocar could barely manage to hover a measly 3 feet off the ground during early testing. Any higher and the saucer would enter a terrifying, uncontrollable wobble known as hubcapping, rocking back and forth violently like a dropped hubcap on concrete. It generated a deafening amount of noise, kicked up blinding dust, and cooked pilots with heat. On our weirdness meter, because the government actually tried building a UFO, the Avrocar scores an 8.5. While the military was failing to build flying saucers, some civilian inventors were looking at everyday household items for aviation inspiration, leading to a bizarre creation that looked exactly like a giant flying metal umbrella. Coming in at number 3 is the incredibly strange Nemeth parasol. Have you ever looked at a perfectly good conventional airplane and thought about replacing the wings with a giant, perfectly round disc? In 1934, a group of university students led by Stephen Nemeth did exactly that. They took a standard fuselage from a conventional biplane and attached a massive circular wing directly above it, making it look like a flying umbrella. The goal was not just to look crazy, it was designed to completely solve the deadly aviation problem of mid-air stalls. Nemeth theorized that a circular wing would maintain lift at impossibly steep angles, making the plane practically stall-proof. Imagine being the test pilot for this strange machine. You are taking off in an aircraft that completely defies all conventional logic of wingspan and aspect ratio, but the absolute craziest part of this entire experiment is that it actually worked flawlessly. The Nemeth parasol was incredibly gentle to fly. The brave pilot could pull the nose up to a terrifyingly steep angle, cut the engine completely, and simply float safely down toward the solid Earth. Instead of plummeting nose first into the dirt, the plane would gently parachute down, landing at a crawling speed of just 25 miles per hour. It was arguably one of the safest airplanes of its era. Unfortunately, the Great Depression meant nobody had the money to buy it. For proving that a flying pizza box can actually save lives, the Nemeth parasol gets a 6.5 on our weirdness meter. Symmetry is the golden rule of aviation. Well, our next aircraft completely threw that rule out, and looking at it might cause headaches. Number 4 brings us to the Blohm & Voss BV-141, a German World War II aircraft that looks like it was assembled incorrectly by a confused mechanic. Designed by Dr. Richard Vogt, this tactical reconnaissance plane is famous for its shocking and extreme asymmetry. The main fuselage, the engine, and the tail were all completely offset to the left side, while the pilot and crew sat in a heavily glazed greenhouse-like pod out on the right wing. The German Air Force specifically requested a scout plane with completely unobstructed forward views. Vogt decided the best solution was to just move the crew entirely out of the way of the spinning propeller. The human stakes for the crew were absolutely terrifying. Sitting inside that fragile glass pod, you were incredibly exposed to enemy machine gun fire, hanging out on the edge of the wing like a sitting duck. Furthermore, it looked like it should immediately spin out of control the second it left the runway. But thanks to brilliant engineering, the weight of the heavy crew pod perfectly counteracted the torque of the massive spinning BMW engine. Test pilots reported that it actually flew beautifully and handled significantly better than many perfectly symmetrical planes. It could reach impressive top speeds of 270 miles per hour. However, its strange looks made military officials deeply uncomfortable, and only a handful were built. For giving every aerodynamicist a severe panic attack, the BV-141 earns a solid 9 on our weirdness meter. Asymmetry is definitely one thing, but what if you built a plane that looked exactly like a giant flying insect with a massive circular ring instead of wings? At number 5 is the Snecma coleoptère, a name which literally translates to beetle in French. This 1950s experimental aircraft looks exactly like a heavy jet engine wearing a giant metal barrel. Instead of traditional wings, it featured an annular or ring wing design. It was explicitly designed for vertical takeoff and landing operations, aiming to allow fast fighter jets to operate without needing long, vulnerable runways. The heavy coleopter would sit straight up on its tail, blast off vertically into the sky like a rocket, and then eventually transition over into horizontal flight. Here is the terrifying part. To land, the aircraft had to transition back to vertical flight and land entirely on its tail. Let us talk about the absolute nightmare this was for the lone test pilot, Auguste Morel. There were absolutely no computers to help him calculate the descent. To land, Morel had to slowly back the heavy aircraft down toward the Earth, essentially flying backward and blind. He was forced to look over his shoulder through a tiny window in the floor, trying to balance a massive jet engine on roaring hot fuel exhaust. During its 9th test flight, the aircraft suddenly lost control while trying to transition back to a vertical hover. It began spinning wildly and plummeted rapidly toward the ground. Morel barely managed to eject safely, but he suffered severe spinal injuries and the bizarre machine was completely destroyed. For its radical ring design and terrifying landing procedure, it gets an 8.5. Pause here. If you had to risk your life testing one of these first 5 planes, which would you choose? Comment below, because the next aircraft definitely requires even more bravery. Number 6 is the Convair XFY-1 Pogo. Built for the United States Navy in the early 1950s, the Pogo was another highly radical attempt at a vertical takeoff and landing fighter. The idea was to put these fighters on the decks of cargo ships for submarine protection. The Pogo featured a delta wing shape and was powered by a massive Allison turboprop engine generating 5,500 horsepower, driving two giant contra-rotating propellers. It sat vertically on the tarmac, resting on small wheels attached directly to its reinforced tail fins. The test pilot Skeets Coleman had to climb up a massive 20-foot ladder just to get into the cramped cockpit. The seat then rotated 90 degrees, so he was lying flat on his back facing the open sky. Taking off was relatively easy. You just throttle up and shoot straight up into the air like a rocket. But landing the Pogo was an exercise in pure, unfiltered terror. Coleman had to approach the landing pad horizontally, pitch the nose straight up, stall the aircraft perfectly in midair, and then back down very slowly downward. He had to constantly look over his shoulder, judging the distance to the solid ground, perfectly fighting unpredictable crosswinds, while a roaring double propeller chewed the air inches from his face. The Navy eventually realized that expecting average combat pilots to perform this circus act on the pitching deck of a moving ship was impossible. For turning pilots into backwards flying astronauts, the Pogo gets an 8. The Pogo was impossibly hard to land, but what if instead of landing on wheels, you had to catch a tiny metal wire mid-air with your nose? At number 7, we have the Ryan X-13 Vertige. The 1950s was an era completely obsessed with making airplanes take off without using runways. But the X-13 took this vertical concept to a whole new level of absolute insanity. It was a sleek jet-powered dart, but if you look very closely, you will quickly notice something extremely important is missing. It had zero landing gear. There were no wheels, no metal skids, absolutely nothing. So how exactly did this jet airplane safely return to the ground? It literally hung from a wire. The Vertige operated entirely from a custom flatbed trailer that could be raised vertically. At the very top of the trailer was a heavy steel cable. The nose of the X-13 featured a small hook. Test pilot Pete Gerard had to fly this jet vertically, inch closer to the raised steel platform, and literally hook the nose of his jet onto the wire, hanging it like a piece of meat. Imagine the sheer human stakes here. You are hovering a screaming jet engine mere feet off the ground, fighting turbulent air with completely obscured vision. You are trying to thread a needle with a multi-million-dollar aircraft. If you miss the wire or if the engine hiccups for a fraction of a second, you crash backward into the earth and violently explode. Gerard successfully demonstrated the concept, but deploying these hooking trailers into active combat zones proved to be an impossible logistical nightmare. For being a dangerous jet-powered ornament hanging on a wire, the Vertige scores an 8. Hanging from a wire is wild, but imagine being stuffed inside a tiny pod and dropped from a massive bomber. Number 8 is the McDonnell XF-85 Goblin, known as the ultimate parasite fighter. In the late 1940s, the Air Force had a massive problem. Their giant B-36 Peacemaker bombers could fly all the way to another continent, but no fighter plane had the fuel range to escort them the whole way. The insane solution was to build a jet fighter so tiny that it could literally fit completely inside the bomb bay of the massive bomber. The Goblin was incredibly small, looking exactly like a flying metallic egg with wings. Weighing just 4,000 pounds, the Goblin had no landing gear at all. When enemy fighters attacked, the bomber would lower the tiny Goblin on a trapeze crane, release it, and the jet would defend the fleet. Once the aerial battle was entirely over, the Goblin had to fly back underneath the massive bomber and hook back onto the swinging metal trapeze mid-air to be pulled inside. Test pilot Ed Schock had to perform one of the most terrifyingly dangerous and physically demanding mid-air docking maneuvers in the entire history of United States military aviation. Connecting a tiny jet to a swinging hook underneath a massive bomber while battling the violent aerodynamic wake was practically suicide. During one terrifying test, the extreme turbulence smashed the Goblin into the heavy trapeze, completely shattering the canopy and knocking the helmet right off the pilot. Miraculously, he survived a high-speed emergency belly landing in the dry desert. For being a deadly flying nesting doll, the Goblin gets a 9. The Goblin was tiny, but our next machine is a massive transforming beast that literally shifted its entire body in order to fly. Coming in at number 9 is the LTVXC-142, a massive 4-engine military transport aircraft developed in the 1960s. It looked exactly like a conventional cargo plane right up until the exact moment it decided to take off. This was known as a tilt-wing aircraft. To achieve vertical takeoff, the aircraft did not just tilt its propellers, it physically rotated its entire massive wing along with all 4 engines a full 90 degrees straight up into the air. When tilted up, it acted like an enormously powerful helicopter. Once high up in the air, the massive wing would slowly rotate back down, allowing it to cruise at impressive speeds of 400 miles per hour. The mechanical complexity of this beast was absolutely staggering, and the human stakes were incredibly high. All 4 engines were permanently linked together by a massive cross-shaft. If one engine failed while hovering, the other 3 engines would keep all 4 propellers spinning rapidly so the plane would not immediately flip over and crash. However, the complex mechanical system suffered from constant, incredibly dangerous and frightening failures. The intense vibrations shook the aircraft violently. The nervous pilots always knew that if the heavy wing tilting mechanism jammed mid-transition, they would be instantly trapped in an unflyable aerodynamic nightmare plunging straight out of the sky. While it eventually proved the radical tilt-wing concept could work, the military deemed it far too mechanically fragile for rugged service. For being a massive transforming aerial machine, the transport earns a 7.5. We have seen flying saucers and umbrellas, but absolutely nothing compares to our final aircraft, which was known to dissolve its pilots. Finally, at number 10, we reach the absolute peak of aviation insanity, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet. Developed by Nazi Germany during the desperate final years of World War II, this was not just an airplane, it was a manned missile. The Comet was a rocket-powered interceptor, explicitly designed to shoot up into the sky at breakneck speeds to attack high-altitude Allied bomber formations. Weighing around 8,000 pounds fully loaded, it was incredibly fast, capable of reaching terrifying speeds over 600 miles per hour, completely outclassing everything the Allies possessed. But the human stakes of flying the Comet were arguably the most horrific in all of aviation history. The extreme danger was not just the enemy aircraft, it was the volatile machine itself. The Comet was powered by 2 incredibly unstable liquid rocket fuels known as T-Stoff and C-Stoff. When combined, they combusted instantly. The primary problem was that T-Stoff was a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide solution that was incredibly corrosive. It was so volatile that any hard landing or minor mechanical leak could easily cause the entire aircraft to violently explode mid-air. Worse still, if a fuel line ruptured inside the cramped cockpit during a violent crash, the toxic T-Stoff would literally dissolve the trapped pilot alive within seconds. Taking off was an absolute nightmare, riding a roaring column of explosive fire. Bouncing on the rough runway during a high-speed landing often resulted in a massive explosion from highly volatile residual fuel. More brave Comet pilots were tragically killed by their own aircraft than by enemy gunfire. For being the ultimate flying death trap, the Comet gets a chilling perfect 10 out of 10 rating. From hollow wooden barrels to deadly rocket planes, aviation history is filled with crazy engineers pushing the limits of physics and human bravery. These vintage airplanes prove the journey to modern flight was never a straight line. Which of these flying machines blew your mind the most? Would you have been brave enough to fly them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments right below. Make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible historical stories.